in front of the National Museum of American History. We're asking people, what is one story or fact that you thought you knew about American history that turned out not to be true?
Growing up, I was always told that George Washington had wooden teeth.
Everybody thought Thomas Edison invented the first light bulb. He actually did not.
I, for some reason, as a little kid, thought that if you were elected president once, you just had to say, oh, I just want to do it again, and you could run again and again and again.
I thought Betsy Ross was the first maker of the U.S. flag. It actually is not.
I thought the American involvement in World War II was we're the heroes of the story, we're the saviors, and in reality there's more to it. There was anti-Semitism at home, there's racism at home, there's a clouded political environment, and there's actually more to the story than just America saved the day.
It's Notes from America. I'm Kai Wright. Welcome to the show. Ron DeSantis has once again succeeded at placing himself at the center of national political conversation. The as yet undeclared presidential contender has learned well from his nemesis, Donald Trump. If you want to distinguish yourself in Republican primary circles, nothing works quite like picking a fight over race, gender, or history, and best if you can hit all three. Schools emerged a few years ago as the preferred venue for these cultural provocations, and I just feel like the rest of us are still sort of reeling in the face of the onslaught. Certainly, I will say that as a host of a show that talks a ton about race, gender, and history, I am preoccupied with the question of how we'll engage usefully in what will absolutely be an intensifying conversation as we head into a presidential election. Which is why I'm excited this week to talk with Princeton University history professor Kevin Kruse. Kevin's scholarship has focused on the evolution of modern conservative politics and its relationship to the civil rights movement, among other things. His most recent book is a collection he co-edited titled Myth America: Historians Take on the Biggest Legends and Lies About Our Past, which perhaps will find itself soon on a banned list in some state. Kevin, thanks for making time for us.
My absolute pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So we got to start with Ron DeSantis.
Yep.
For those who haven't kept up, here's the story in short. The DeSantis administration has refused to allow Florida students to get a new advanced placement course on Black studies. The College Board, which oversees AP studies, subsequently announced changes to the curriculum, which the board says were already in progress well before the controversy in Florida. They merely reflect the evolution of the course from a pilot initiative to an official framework. But the whole thing has been deeply disturbing to many. And Kevin, what did you see as you watched the story unfold?
Well, I was struck by, Ron DeSantis appearing behind a banner or something about being against indoctrination as the governor is trying to tell people what to think. Right. was kind of deeply ironic. But also, I thought he kind of perfectly crystallized a real problem we have with the way in which people understand civil rights history in particular. He said, we don't need to go into all this critical race theory stuff. We don't need to talk about structural inequalities and systematic racism. Instead, we just need to know that there were a few brave people who felt the need to stand up and did so. Period. Full stop. Okay. Some follow-up questions for that. Why did they feel the need to stand up? Why did they have to stand up? Why was it difficult? Why do we praise these people? And he's got this vision of American history that is, in his words, cut and dry. Yeah. It's not cut and dry. And the civil rights movement is a perfect example of this. So we've got an essay in the book by Glenda Gilmore, Yale historian, who leans right into this. And Glenda's chapter is called The Myth of the Good Civil Rights Protest. And you might think, well, okay, why is it bad if we say civil rights protests were good? Well, we've put them on a pedestal so far out of reach from today, right? We've sterilized and sanitized the civil rights struggle to the point where apparently the only phrase Martin Luther King Jr. ever spoke right. was that one line about judging his kids not by the color of their skin, but by the content of the character. Full stop. That was it. And so we've reduced King's message to that. We've cut off all the stuff he had to say about, even in the March on Washington address, even on the one speech they apparently know, he talks about structural poverty. He talks about police brutality. He talks about all of these issues. He later on went on to deep denunciations of capitalism and militarism. So this was King's shtick. It was very radical. But again, we've reduced King to this very narrow vision. And in doing so, we've said, well, who could be opposed to that, right? So there was no controversy. There was no scandal. There was no sense that this was, as many people called it at the time, socialism, Marxism. This was un-American. He was a radical. King, by the end of his life, is deeply unpopular. He's polling in like the 30s, right before he's assassinated. And he is, by the way, assassinated. That's sort of a data point in how controversial the man was. And yet we've reduced it, and people like DeSantis put up that image of Martin Luther King. Why? It's to say, oh, fine, this thing in the past we now agree on, and there's no connective tissue to the present, right? So you hold up the good civil rights protest to say these protests today are bad. These protests today block traffic. Well, they made the same complaints literally about the March on Washington. These protests today are disruptive. They're bad for the economy. They're divisive. They're driven by leftists. All these claims were made about the civil rights struggle of the 60s. And yet, if you've drawn this false dividing line between the past and the present, it's an attempt to make that past sealed off and useless for us when it's really vibrant and important today.
Can you just say a little bit more about that DeSantis quote that he said, history should be, quote, just cut and dried history, and that Black history, said, you learn all the basics, you learn about the great figures, and, I view it as American history. And I do feel like it sort of connects to the larger thesis of the book that you have produced here. Like, for that sounds on its face, maybe to some, straightforward and reasonable. It's just basic history. Yeah. Why is that a controversial idea? Can you just address that notion that like history should be, that there's basic history and some other kind of history? Yeah.
The idea, and this is remarkable. I think DeSantis was a history major, so he should have learned this at some point. History isn't cut and dry. There was not some, tome of facts that has been handed down in generations, and we all read off the same book. If history is cut and dry, someone's got to cut it. Someone's got to dry it, right? And another essay in the book, I think, speaks to this beautifully. Karen Cox's essay on Confederate monuments, right? We are told by people on the right that the effort to tear down Confederate monuments is destroying history. Now, a newsflash for those who haven't been in a classroom in a long time, historians actually don't use statues and monuments in the classroom. They're much too large. They're really unwieldy. Instead, we use these things called books and primary sources. Well, the problem with this argument that tearing down the monuments distorts history is it ignores why those monuments went up and when they went up. These aren't monuments that were created right in the aftermath of the Civil War. No, they were created largely in the 19-teens and 1920s, and again in the 1950s and 1960s. And why were they created? Well, they were created during periods of massive mobilization of white supremacy across the South. And we have the documents from the speeches people gave when they dedicated these, and they tell us exactly why they were there. And it was clearly to buttress white supremacy. I went to the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. We had a monument there called Silent Sam. And you can read the dedication speech to this. In the speech, Julian Carr says this monument is going up as a reminder, and he points as a reminder to that Negro wench over there to remember whose society this is. It's not very subtle, right? But so that in and of itself, these Confederate monuments were an effort to rewrite the history of the past.
Right.
And so the effort to tear them down isn't tearing down real history, it's tearing down a fake history, right? Someone else cut and dried that history for Ron DeSantis. He wanted to go and look at it and say, that was history. No, we have to understand the process of this. It's a constant changing. People talk about revisionist history is bad. All good history is revisionist. We're constantly reviving our understandings, reviving our interpretations, revising our conclusions about it, right? That's what we do.
And the Confederate monuments is a really stark example. We're going to walk through a bunch of those that follow a very similar pattern that you get to in your book. And listeners, we will have time for a couple of your calls in this too. So I'd love to hear how any misconception about American political history has shown up in your own life. Maybe it's because you're a parent and it came up with something with your kids have or have not learned in school, or maybe it's something you learned recently that was really impactful to you. Share your story, 844-745-TALK. That's 844-745-8255. Or if you're on YouTube, drop it in the chat. Kevin, why this book now? Why did you feel like you and your co-editor, Julian Zelizer, that this was the time for this book?
Yeah, well, there's always been assaults on history. There have always been myths and misunderstandings about American history. That's a constant. And historians have always been pushing back against them. But in the last 5 to 6 years, the kind of the broad Trump era, we really saw this reach kind of a crescendo. The amount of things in which people were saying at the state level, from people like DeSantis and Governor Abbott in Texas, certainly at a national level, the Trump administration was a nonstop set of claims about the history of politics of the presidency, in which Trump was the best at this and the biggest at that, whatever. To the final days of the Trump administration was this effort to put out what he called this 1776 commission that was going to engage in, quote, patriotic education. Notably a plan that had no American historians involved in the final report because it was so at odds with what American historians have done. So throughout all these years, historians have been active in pushing back on these things. One of the bright spots of this moment is that the very same venues like social media that let a lot of these lies and misinformation about the history spread, we can also use to push back. So we've all been engaged on, Twitter, Facebook, Substack, things like that, to push back on this. But we thought, well, that's fine that we do all that kind of stuff in the public media sphere, but what do historians do best? Well, we write. So we decided to get some of these people together to write what we think are kind of short, accessible chapters designed for a general audience, meant to be read by people who don't have a PhD, but want to know what the field has found about these big issues.
And one of the things, just to underline quickly before we go to a break, that you're saying, one of the things that's unique about this moment is the effort to rewrite history in real time, is something you say in the book.
Yeah, exactly. It's happening constantly. It's not this, thinking about it a few years in the past. We saw this with January 6th, right? I mean, as soon as the first papers were, the headlines were dry on them, there was an effort to kind of change the picture right away. So we're kind of seeing this unfold in an incredibly quick fashion.
Which is different than the lost cause kind of mythology that you just talked about before, that took decades to unfold.
That's right. Yeah. The lost cause was, 40, 50 decades in the making.
And now it's happened in a couple of days.
Exactly. A news cycle, and we're done. Yeah.
I'm talking with Kevin Kruse, co-editor of the new book, Myth America. Historians take on the biggest lies and legends about our past. And listeners, you're welcome to chime in as well. We'd love to hear from you if you have had any misconceptions about American political history show up in your own life. Maybe as a parent, maybe as something that you've learned recently that you were surprised to figure out. Let us know about it. 844-745-TALK. That's 844-745-8255. Or if you're watching on YouTube, drop it in the chat. Stay with us. It's Notes from America. I'm Kai Wright, and I'm joined by Kevin Kruse, co-editor of the new book, Myth America, Historians Take on the Biggest Legends and Lies About Our Past. We're talking about how those legends and lies are kind of getting new life in real time right now in our political life. Let's go straight to Martin in the Bronx here in New York. Martin, welcome to the show.
Yes, good afternoon, or good evening, rather. I did have a question, but first I'm going to preface that question by recommending a great book on the subject of neoconservatism. It's called The Culture of Critique by Dr. Kevin McDonald. And with regard to the origin of this sort of American exceptionalism, the idea that the United States is not beholden to international law or to any international or supranational bodies like the UN, etc., or even things like the Geneva Conventions, I think it very much is centered and couched in neoconservative ideology. This idea that the United States can act unilaterally, particularly in a military fashion.
Martin, let me ask you.
Fit.
You said you had a question.
Go ahead. Oh yes. I just wanted to find out what the author's take is on, basically the neoconservative origins of American exceptionalism.
I'm going to let you go, Martin. So first off, I just want to say that The Culture of Critique, I think our producers are looking it up, but I don't think you want to go check out that book. Kevin, you're shaking your head no. Can you help us fact check that? And then I do want to talk about American exceptionalism and its history.
Yeah, so American exceptionalism does have a neoconservative origin, but our piece in that book is written by David Bell, who's a colleague of mine at Princeton, a French historian actually, who writes about this beautifully kind of from outside the field. And what he notes is that, yeah, neoconservatives certainly popularized this term in the 90s, but the origins of the term come with a very different person on the political spectrum. It's really Joseph Stalin who helped popularize this in the 1930s. And the idea isn't that, the caller said, America is not beholden to the laws of the world. The original idea was that America wasn't really following the laws of history as Marxists understood them. There were certain lines of development in which a country would naturally progress towards communism, and America didn't have certain parts of that long history, didn't have a feudal past, didn't have other things, and therefore it was the exception to the rule. And this is why American communists started trotting this term out to explain to a very angry Stalin why they hadn't succeeded in rooting communism in America. So it was for a long time an academic term. And then it gets resurfaced again by the neoconservatives, largely from Newt Gingrich, who himself had a PhD in American history, liked to think of himself as an academic, and took this term that was largely still in kind of seminar rooms and made it something in his stump speeches. And there it was, not just that America's different, but America's better.
And, which is one of the most ironic turns in our misconceptions. I also want to just really underline The Culture of Critique. That book is an anti-Semitic book explicitly. I think that's the second time someone has called in to try to troll us with that book. And I just want to take a minute on that, Kevin, because part of what we have in this moment in these debates about history is it feels like not everybody is engaging the conversation with goodwill.
Yeah.
And I just go ahead.
Yeah, and that's the problem. Like, I mean, when you open the show, I heard a bunch of things that people, there were myths that they heard about American past, about Betsy Ross or George Washington and the cherry tree, and these are certainly myths, and historians have talked about that. That's not what we're talking about. Those are myths that don't have any malice behind them, right? That aren't, nobody's trying to, maybe some mom is trying to trick their child into, not telling lies by telling them the George Washington story, but there's nothing more sinister than that. What we have today are a set of lies about the American past that are consciously being spread by people who have a political agenda in mind. So if you don't want the government to be involved in the economy, you spread lies that the New Deal was a failure or the Great Society made poverty worse or things like that. And so, or again, the line about the old civil rights movement being nothing like Black Lives Matter. You spread that story to try to dry up support for Black Lives Matter. So I think there really are some people, not everyone, but some people out there really do have some real partisan motives to spread these things, and that's what makes it really hard. In the past, we've always argued about, well, which facts are more important, right? But today we've been reduced to arguing, no, which facts are really facts, right? Because people are just inventing things out of whole cloth. It's not a spin on the past. It's in some cases complete denial of the actual reality of what happened.
Oh, along those lines, one of the things I learned from reading your collection is I was surprised to learn there is an actual effort to argue that the Southern strategy didn't exist. So the Southern strategy being the strategy of the Republican Party that developed to exploit a white backlash to the civil rights movement and build a Southern base. There's there is now a real effort to say that that's not a fact anymore.
Yeah, it's remarkable. If you told me, this is the essay I wrote, if you told me 10, 15 years ago, I'd have to write that this thing really happened, I would have laughed at you because it was the most common conventional wisdom among historians and political scientists. And it's because this is not a hidden history. It is very obvious and in plain sight. Nixon talks about this in his memoirs. Goldwater does. Nixon's aide, Harry Dent, Strom Thurmond, Kevin Phillips, another Nixon architect, talks about this in the newspaper at the time. It's all over the archives. It's all over their memoirs. It's all over the newspapers and media of the day. It's right out in plain sight. And yet, in recent years, even though there was a moment, again, 10 years ago, in which leaders of the Republican Party were not only acknowledging this, they were apologizing for this. Ken Mellman, the head of the RNC, apologized to the NAACP. Michael Steele, an African-American head of the RNC, also apologized for it. And there was a sense there in kind of the Bush era, the George W. Bush era, that the Republican Party was reckoning with this past and turning the page, right? They were moving on to a much more racially diverse party, and they were making peace with the past, and we're going to turn the page. Well, in the era of Trump, that all got undone. And I think the effort was here, the point was, we're being accused of racism today. An easy way to deny that is to deny that we had ever done anything racist in the past, right? And so they went from simply apologizing for the Southern strategy to pretending it never happened, right? And this is, people like Dinesh D'Souza or Carol Swain did a video for Prager University in which he said the Southern strategy was a myth created by liberal elitists in the last decade or so, right? It's kind of, or I don't remember what date you put on it, but it was a recent invention and wholly created out of nothing. And yet it's right there. So I went in and wrote this piece on the Southern strategy, which was actually good for me because I constantly was debating people online who were pushing this argument. And there was no good short text to recommend.
Because it didn't need to exist before that.
It didn't need to exist before, right? So you had either
one.
people refer to it in passing, or they had these 900-page tomes, which I couldn't recommend to someone on Twitter. So I wrote the thing myself. It's what it's what teachers often do. You want to assign a text, it's not there. Write it yourself.
We're getting short on time, but I want to sneak in another call. Patricia in Westfield, New Jersey. Patricia, welcome to the show.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for this conversation. Can you hear me?
We can. You got about 30 seconds, Patricia.
Great. I just wanted to say you can't have American history without African American history.
Yeah.
You cannot.
Yeah.
And
that's
Black
one level
history
where
is not a footnote.
That's right. And that's one level where I think Ron DeSantis was actually right. He said African-American history is American history. Yes, that's true. But it's not subsumed on that, right? I mean, the whole point of African-American studies, it came out of the Black Power movement in the late 60s and early 70s. That's the reason we have colleges that teach this stuff. If you've got an AP course that's leading up to that thing, you've got to have the origins of this movement in mind, which come out of a kind of a radical engagement with the moment of the late 60s and early 70s.
Kevin, as we're starting to wrap up, and I'm thinking about the consequences of this stuff, this fight over history, do you worry about the well-meaning people who watch this stuff play out and decide, I guess you can never know what's true or not? I mean, history, who was there? How much do you hear that kind of thing nowadays?
I do hear a lot of that. We often hear this in the phrase of maybe not who knows, but we can't judge those people. They were a person of their time. Yeah, but there were other people of their time, right? So again, the Confederate monument piece, we often hear, these were products of their time. We shouldn't judge them. No, African Americans at the time, these things were going up, were screaming about how bad they were and how horrible they were and how false the history was. So there are voices out there we just got to listen. So I'd say rather than taking the experts versus experts, look at the source material, right? So we point people in this book to a lot of primary sources they can look up themselves, really dig in and get the history yourself.
You refer in the book to bipartisan myths. I just want to get to this quickly because you talk about partisan myths and say that they're actually some of the most enduring. What is a bipartisan myth? Can you give an example of that and why it's so enduring?
Yeah, well, so bipartisan myths are ones that aren't really kind of pushed with a partisan angle like the Southern strategy attack, but rather, again, the idea of American exceptionalism. America was never an empire. Native Americans have vanished from among us. These are held broadly across the political aisle, and so they don't seem to have a partisan motive, and therefore we assume they must be true. But it is the case that sometimes we've all been fooled across the partisan spectrum, and so there are ones that don't have that kind of political motive.
Have you in fact been banned yet? Has the book yet been banned somewhere?
Not yet, but fingers crossed. It's a sign we're doing God's work.
Indeed. Kevin Kruse is a professor of history at Princeton University and co-editor of the new book, Myth America: Historians Take on the Biggest Legends and Lies About Our Past. Kevin, thanks for making this time for us.
Hey, thanks for having me. This was great.
And coming up next, since Ron DeSantis has not yet managed to cancel Black History Month, and since we're going to be coming right up onto the Grammys when this show goes off, we're going to kick off our own Black History series with a romp through some fun Black music history. That's coming up. Notes from America has a deep interest in Black history all year round. You know that. But we do also take note of Black History Month. And this year, we're thinking about it in the present tense. Throughout February, we'll bring you a series of conversations we're loosely calling Black History is Now. We're going to meet people doing cool things in Black spaces who think about their work as part of a continuum. Like it grew out of something that came before. It's trying to feed something or someone that's going to come after. Emil Wilbekin is one such person. The Grammys are tonight, and it's worth thinking about just how dominant both hip hop and R&B are in today's global music market. Industry data suggests these genres easily combine for the largest market share. At one point a few years back, Nielsen data showed 8 out of the 10 most streamed artists were rappers. And Emil Wilbekin had a front row seat for the era in which the seeds of that commercial dominance were planted, the early 1990s, a time when the success of a few massive Black artists, people like Michael Jackson and Prince and Tina Turner, kind of opened the commercial door for this eruption of unapologetically Black popular culture.
There were Black fashion designers, there were Black fashion models, there was, movies and TV. So we were very, very present, and it was exciting. It was an exciting time to be Black, right? There was this exciting time to see yourself represented on all platforms of media.
Emil helped build one of the most important platforms for showcasing that talent. He was one of the founding editors of Vibe magazine, which was created by Quincy Jones in 1992 to chronicle the moment. And Vibe was where a lot of people who became synonymous with 90s music. I mean, Mary J. Blige, Snoop, Biggie. It's where they made their glossy debut into popular media. Emil was part of Vibe's team throughout the decade and went on to serve as its editor-in-chief, where he won a National Magazine Award, a recognition that few people back in 1992 could have imagined for a magazine about hip-hop. He's still writing about music and culture these days, and he's leading a project called Native Son, which builds community among Black queer men. I asked Emil to situate his own life's work in the continuum of Black music history, starting with a TV show that shaped his dreams as a little boy in the early 70s.
Soul Train in my household was a ritual every Saturday morning. We would have brunch, which we actually called brunch, which is funny. It's like, shows you how bougie I am. But we had brunch, and, my mother would cook, and we would sit there as a family and watch Soul Train.
Soul Train.
And it it was just a cultural ritual. It was a Black ritual. It was inspiring. It was kind of like Saturday church for us.
Mm. And as a kid watching that, like, what was capturing your imagination?
So for me, being the creative kid that I was, it was everything from the music, the choreography and dancing, and then the outfits. I mean, for me, it was like a plethora of creativity and Black brilliance, right? Just what wasn't inspiring when you watch Soul Train, right?
And of course, the Don Cornelius of it all.
And the Scrabble board.
Yes.
Cornelia. Hey there, and welcome aboard. You're right on time for another magnificent ride on the Soul Train.
So talk to me about both him and his place in this cultural history.
Well, I think Don Cornelius, for me, really represents, a Black shepherd of culture, right? He really believed in holding space for us to see ourselves. And so Black music has always been kind of regulated to the sidelines, not given credit for being, the first sound of rock and roll or having the most incredible voices that then uplift everyone else. We were always kind of in the back. And so for Don Cornelius to have this vision to televise a show that brought the music to life, that made us the superstars, the centerpieces. We were the first act, the second act, and the third act, right? And we were able to dance to our own music, and we let other cultures in to share in that revelry, because that's what Black people do. And to own that space and own that representation of Black art. I think that's what I give Don Cornelius credit for.
Why was the television part of it important? I'm thinking about the Grammys and these big TV moments. Why was that crucial?
I mean, television then was the future, right? And so, American Bandstand and Dick Clark, they all had these dance shows.
From Philadelphia, it's time for America's favorite dance party, American Band.
White teens would go on there dancing to Black music. But we never had a platform where we could see ourselves dancing to our own music, right? And so I think televising it gave it more power, and it reached a broader audience.
So Soul Train inspired a young Emil Wilbekin. After a break, we'll learn how he and his colleagues at Vibe then built another platform for bringing a new kind of Black music to a broader commercial audience. Stay with us. It's Notes from America. I'm Kai Wright. And this week we're beginning a series we're loosely calling Black History is Now. I'm talking with Emil Wilbekin, one of the founding editors of Vibe magazine in the early 1990s, about how Soul Train laid a foundation for his own life's work. So I asked Emil about the creation of the Soul Train Awards in 1986. I came across this quote from Don Cornelius. He said at the time they were asking him about why he was creating it. And he said, "We tend to get taken for granted. We tend to get ignored as a group of creative people. Black music is too big and too powerful not to have its own award show."
That's right.
And, but to me, it's a harder idea to understand that in 2023, I think, maybe than the 1986 reality he's describing. I mean, there are many challenges for Black artists today, but in a world of, Beyonce and Jay-Z, not to mention Lizzo and Lil Nas X, and, I think it's hard to really grasp what he's talking about there. Can you help people understand, like, what role the Soul Train Awards was filling in the culture?
Well, I think for us, it was really filling this void of you didn't see us front and center on award shows, right? We may perform, we may present, but not in a way where it was our music, our audience, our community. And I think it's something that back then was a big deal. This is around the time, too, of music videos really coming into play. So it's a parallel path of the music videos and what MTV was doing, but MTV still wasn't showing a lot of Black music. So there wasn't a place to see ourselves projected in this way and then celebrated by our own. And I think that's what made the Soul Train Awards so special, because it's our people, it's for us, by us, and honoring us, right?
Yeah. It makes me think about other sort of big Black-led TV moments in music. Like, we have to talk about Motown 25.
Yes.
I still have such a clear emotional memory of that broadcast. I was 10 years old, but the moment of Michael Jackson coming out in that glove and a hat and debuting the moonwalk. Do you have a memory of that?
I mean, yes. And it's like you can never unsee it, because, when we talk about kind of Black magic, right? That's what I think of when I think from a cultural perspective. What he was doing almost didn't feel human, because the way he was moving, it was so smooth. The music, the outfit, and he literally took everyone's breath away.
This got Emil and I talking about other moments in which Black artists made really disruptive appearances in mainstream TV shows like the Grammys and the Oscars. A beautiful one was at the 1988 Grammys when opera superstar Luciano Pavarotti canceled at the last minute, and they had to get Aretha Franklin to step in for him.
I mean, Aretha Franklin, first of all, greatest voice of all time, stepping in for Pavarotti at the last minute and kind of reading through this aria and kind of phonetically memorizing it, right, to come out and sing. So for an opera singer, period, that is a huge feat to perform that song and live, right? And then for her to be able to do that in not much time and to really slay it, I mean, it really showed you how Black art transforms genres, right?
Is it fair to talk about those kind of movements in the way I did, like as disruptions?
I think disruption is right, because as much as we lead so much of culture, we still were not given full credit. And that's why I was kind of thinking about your previous question about you can't really see that today, but you still can, actually, because we're still left out of so many conversations, and we're still kind of second-class citizens in many ways. We always, as Black people, have to disrupt things to make sure that we get credit for things. So, of course, if Aretha Franklin's going to give him the opportunity to sing opera at the Grammys, she's gonna slay, because that's what we do.
Well, all of this history informed and inspired your professional choices, I gather. Talk about how you understood the work you and your colleagues set out to do when you created Vibe in 1993.
So, yeah, Vibe was definitely a very special moment in time. And I always tell people it was my first great love because our mission, basically dictated by Quincy Jones, was how do we celebrate Black music and culture in a way that Rolling Stone had for rock and roll and the way that Vanity Fair had for Hollywood. And there was just a group of us that believed that these stories were really important, that these artists were larger than life. And we wanted to bring that to life in a time where hip hop is just really starting to build its foundation in a way that popular music is kind of paying attention to it, but not really. And so it was this very, very profound moment in time of like, what does a magazine look like that celebrates hip hop, R&B, rap music, dancehall reggae, dub music? What does that look like? And then it was just all these people clamoring to be in the magazine and on the covers because they weren't seen in mainstream publications, and definitely not on the cover, unless they died. So it was a huge opportunity.
Unless they died.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, unless they died.
What role you think it played in like the commercial world of music for these artists?
Well, it was important for record labels specifically who didn't have a lot of venues to place their artists, right? So, you know, they would sell, right? But being on the cover of Vibe magazine or being featured in Vibe magazine was a really, really big deal because it was co-signing kind of from Quincy Jones, right? And his legacy that this is what's hot, this is what's next. So, you know, the first issue was Tretch from Naughty by Nature. Because OPP was huge in the streets, in the hood.
Yeah.
But after that, it was huge on MTV. Right? And so, you know, the second cover is Snoop Dogg.
From the depths of the sea, back to the black Snoop Doggy Dogg Funky is the
And like that, I mean, people knew kind of who he was in West Coast music, but to be on the cover of Vibe magazine with a full cover story, I think pretty much helped launch his career. And so we saw that happen over and over again.
We, of course, cannot talk about Vibe and its history in this moment without touching on its role in the dispute between Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls. Biggie was ultimately killed outside of a Vibe after party for the Soul Train Awards in 1997. A variety of media have been blamed for inflaming the tensions between those artists and generally the idea of beef in hip hop. I don't really want to litigate that dispute so much as I just wonder about how you think about Biggie's death in that moment and whether was it or was it not a marker of some sort in this history that we're talking about?
I think that Biggie's death was definitely a very dark marker and moment for Black culture, right? And Black history, because arguably still the best rapper of all time is struck down way early in his career. And I think the fact that it was kind of centered around gang-related violence, East Coast, West Coast, and Black on Black crime, like Black folks beefing with other Black folks about who's the best. That's sad to me, you know? Biggie and Tupac separately, both brilliant, young Black men who are also like a window to the future, right? They're kind of shifting the way that we ingest music, that we think about our community, that we think about how we look as Black men, how we move through this world. And then because of a battle between both fractions, the two stars both get killed. It's like Shakespearean, really. And, unfortunately, it was a really hard moment to be at Vibe at that time because as exciting as everything was happening with the music and the culture and the vibrance of it all, it was scary because you never knew if you were at a party, what would happen. There was just a lot of violence at that time that, is unfortunate because it kind of spoke to white supremacy and how, we can turn on each other, right? Like get them to turn on each other. And that's what happened. It's really sad.
Tell me about your work on Native Son. Your work at Vibe was at least in part giving Black artists the celebration and attention that part of the commercial mainstream denied them. And I do wonder about your experience of that as a Black gay man.
Sure. So Native Son is a movement, community, and platform which was created to inspire and empower and celebrate Black, gay, and queer men. I was the first openly gay Black man to edit a national magazine. And so when we won the National Magazine Award for General Excellence, it was a really big deal because heretofore, Black gay men kind of were always regulated to the backdrop, right? We were the choreographer, the hairdresser, the stylist. We may have had some role, but it wasn't really given a lot of attention. And so one of the things that I did while I was editor-in-chief was ensure that we were covering HIV and AIDS. We were covering LGBTQ folks across the spectrum at a time where that wasn't popular. And so I got a lot of heat for doing that coverage, but I felt like it was important as a Black gay man to bring those stories to the forefront, but also to overall health and well-being of the Black community. We needed to have those conversations. So a lot of that is kind of what led to where we are now with Native Son. And I would have to say that also a big chunk of my time at Essence after Vibe really inspired a lot of Native Son. So I saw how Black women really lifted each other up in the way that Essence did.
Say more about that for a second. What do you unpack that a little bit about what you learned at Essence that you thought this is an important idea for me to carry forward amongst Black queer men?
Sure. I mean, Essence Black Women in Hollywood was like this huge lunch that they did during the Oscars to celebrate, Black women in Hollywood who were breaking through. And I sat there like, I want this for my community. I want to be in community with other Black, gay, and queer men and feel empowered and inspired. And so what does that look like? And I remember being at this, it was like a women's empowerment luncheon that Lisa Nichols was hosting. And she talked about not pouring from your cup being empty, but from the overflow. Mm-hmm. And all the things she talked about, like I literally was like, bawling in the audience, and I ran backstage to where she would come out, and I was like, I need to talk to you because you just moved me in this way, and I know I'm not the target audience at this event, but you spoke to me. And so a lot of that, like, how do we as a community lift each other up? How do we see each other? How do we celebrate each other? How do we show up for each other? Really stuck with me. And I started researching kind of famous Black gay men. And it was really hard to find pictures, and it was really hard to find information. And the more I dug, the more I was like, there's a need to create a platform, a movement where we see each other, that we know from whence we came.
Emil, we first met in, I don't remember if it was the late 90s or early 2000s, as part of an effort to organize Black gay men around the response to HIV and sort of raise consciousness amongst ourselves. And I think about that moment in the context of Native Son and the work you're doing now. And I guess it just makes me want to think about the arc of Black gay male consciousness in the culture. From when we met to now. I don't know. What does that make you think about?
It makes me think about creating safe spaces. And I mean, that's what Native Son really does, because when we met, it was a safe space, right? Where we talked about who we are in the world, but who we are as Black, gay, and queer folks in that particular space. And I think that we don't have enough of those safe spaces in the world. And so Native Son is really creating that, where people can come out and say, hey, I'm HIV positive, or hey, I may have drug addiction, or hey, this and that, but I'm still okay. I'm still good because my community is going to support me in that. You know, I think what's definitely different from that moment in time when we met to now is that CDC report hadn't come out, right? That in our lifetime, 1 in 2 Black gay men who have sex with men will contract HIV.
50%.
And so there's so much work that still needs to be done. And a lot of it can only be done in safe spaces.
Where do you see yourself and the work that you have done and the work that you are doing in the continuum of our history?
Well, I think you said it best earlier about disruption, right? And being disruptors. And I feel like I'm disrupting culture and community and really kind of presenting for a future generation, this is who you are. This is where you came from. And there's a whole community that looks like you that are thriving, surviving, and shining bright, right? I never thought that I would see in my lifetime a Little Nas X. Call me when you want, call me when you need, call me in the morning. Let alone a Saucy Santana. So to have those artists exist in a world where they can be free, and then on top of it, you know, win Grammys and VMAs is almost beyond my wildest imagination. So if we can feed that, support that, and just build up this community of Black, gay, and queer folks so that they feel comfortable in the world and the world understands who they are and respects them for that, then Black history's been made.
Thank you so much for that role in history and for this time.
No, thank you for having me. This is amazing.
Notes from America is a production of WNYC Studios. Keep up with the show by following us wherever you get your podcasts and on Instagram at Notes with Kai. And you can always talk to us by going to our website at notesfromamerica.org, where you can just click on a little record button and leave us a voicemail right there. We'd love to hear from you. Mixing and theme music by Jared Paul. Matthew Mirando is our live engineer. Reporting, producing, and editing by Karen Frillman, Vanessa Handy, Regina DeHeer, Rahima Nassa, Kusha Navadar, and Lindsay Foster Thomas. Andre Robert Lee is our executive producer, and I am Kai Wright. Thanks for spending this time with us.